in the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. This is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson. We're flying solo today, which is a little bit different than usual. For those of you who've been listening or watching the podcast over the last 6 or 7 months, I don't think I've done a solo episode since kind of earlier as the podcast was just going and we were kind of experimenting with formats. I'm flying solo because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, I wanted to get a podcast out. And this is exam week here at Arizona State University. It's also, and so it's end of the semester around the country. So trying to get a guest to discuss anything academic or research wise is a little bit difficult. And I didn't want to bring on a student to talk about anything because, of course, they're in the throes of exams. And so I decided that I was just going to do this one solo. Um, we've got some really exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks. So stay tuned. We are going to go on a summer schedule, though, which means we've been doing 2 episodes a week for the last 6 or 7 months. Moving forward for the summer, we're going to go to 1 episode a week. Summer vacation, that kind of thing. Kind of harder to pin people down. We are going to do a slight adjustment as far as hosting duties go as well. South Dakota Jack, my great co-host, is heading to Europe in about a month for I think for the rest of 2026. So since he's going to Europe, I believe he's going to Prague and then Florence. So he will no longer be South Dakota Jack. He will be Cosmopolitan Jack. Um, by the time he returns. And so, with that being said, I brought on another student from the Politics and Leadership program here at Arizona State University at the Center for American Institutions, who sponsors this podcast. Andrew Ritter, who, if anybody watched or saw the podcast where we discussed China and Taiwan, he was on that one. He's an incredibly interesting, smart young man, and I think I'll have him on next week to properly introduce you. On top of that, we have several like really, really interesting guests that we're just trying to figure out the right time to record um, for the summer. So really looking forward to that. People, please stay tuned. Tune in. You're going to hear some really interesting things, I promise. So anyway, with all that being said, again, it's just me for this episode, and so because it's just me, I was trying to think of something I could talk about with just me. I prefer talking with other people, speaking with other people, getting their insights on things. But I've been asked many times over the last 2 weeks here, living in Arizona, about Alberta separatism. Now, we did an episode on Alberta separatism, I don't know, 3 months ago. Jack and I did. We kind of talked about various constitutional crises in Canada. We compared Alberta separatism to Quebec separatism. So feel free to go back and check out that episode. But I felt like it was probably, people might find it interesting for me to just do a deep dive on Alberta separatism. Americans have become aware of Alberta separatism. It's been in the news a little bit the last several months, particularly in the last couple of weeks, as there's been a couple of competing petitions that have gotten the requisite number of signatures that will make sure that, or that give the opportunity at least for the provincial government to have a referendum on whether Canada or whether Albertans wish for Alberta to remain within Confederation. And when I say Confederation, for people who don't know, in Canada, that's sort of the equivalent of saying in the Union. So I'm going to use that term a lot throughout this episode. I'm going to talk about Confederation, and what that essentially means is the agreement among the provinces to form a country. So the Canadian Union is considered Confederation. It's called Confederation. And Confederation, for those who don't know, began in 1867 as a union of the remaining British North American colonies, which at the time were Canada East and Canada West, which became Quebec and Ontario, respectively. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick were the four that formed the country or formed the Dominion, I should say, initially. And that sort of formed into one country. They've been Well, Canada East and Canada West were kind of one colony. It's kind of difficult to explain. We don't really need to get into it here. But New Brunswick and Nova Scotia were separate colonies. The four of them were united into one big dominion with a federal parliament that was in Ottawa. Eventually in Ottawa, wasn't eventually in Ottawa. A few years later, Prince Edward Island joined as the fifth province. Later, Manitoba, which at that point was just largely around the area of Winnipeg, but eventually it expanded into all of Winnipeg, and then British Columbia joined, which was on the west coast, and then eventually, in the early 20th century, Saskatchewan and Alberta joined as provinces into Confederation. The last province to join was Newfoundland, and that happened in 1949. And there was a referendum to join Canada in 1949 under this really interesting, kind of irascible leader named Joey Smallwood, who has a very long, colorful history in Newfoundland. If you're interested, I highly encourage you to look up this very interesting figure of Joey Smallwood, who was the premier of Newfoundland. So anyway, when I talk about Confederation, that's what I mean. Anyway, so there's um, been a movement in Alberta that has made international headlines for Alberta to secede from Confederation or to leave Confederation. What that would actually look like is kind of difficult to imagine, and I think people have different ideas in their heads. But what it essentially means, anyway, leaving Confederation. This is clearly, people think there's something here. I kind of have been, Alberta separatism has been around for a long time. Okay, it's been around for a long time. It's typically been a very small, I'm not going to use the word fringe because that gets people really upset, but was a very small minority opinion until recently. It kind of ebbed and flowed. There were a couple of moments where there was some energy behind it in the past, but typically it's been a pretty small movement. But it is clearly, there's something here. How I know that the international community is taking it seriously is because the New York Times, of all places, just put a job ad out for a Western Canada reporter, paying them actually an absurdly high sum in order to do it. The New York Times, a paper of record, whatever people might think of the New York Times, is still probably the most consequential paper in North America. The fact that it is taking Western Canadian politics seriously enough to pay a reporter to be on that beat full time is frankly indicates that at least in the boardroom of the New York Times, they think there's something happening. It has been one of the two main stories in Canada over the last year and a half. The dominant storyline has been Canada's relationship with the United States since the election of Donald Trump and Donald Trump's threats to annex Canada, and then the tariffs that were imposed, and the very fractured trade negotiations, which probably I'm not going to get into too much here. But that's kind of been the dominant story in Canadian politics. But the second story has been this Alberta separatism movement. And the fact that this Alberta separatism movement has happened during the negotiations with the United States over trade policy, and then the threats to annex, which are I haven't heard those threats in a long time now. But anyway, there were some threats. Some people took it seriously. Some people continue to take it very seriously. Has led many people outside of Alberta to accuse people in Alberta essentially of treason. They're saying you're going to threaten to split apart this country at a time when the country has never seemed more vulnerable. For some Albertans, the answer is yes. Frankly, the answer is yes. Because to those people, and this is something that I think Canadians outside of Alberta, particularly Canadians who are in Ontario, have a hard time kind of wrapping their heads around is for many people in Alberta, Canada is just not all that meaningful as a notion. Confederation doesn't mean much to them. Their Alberta identity is considerably more important to them than their Canadian identity. I talked a little bit about this in the previous episode about with Jack, but this is going back a couple of decades now, so I mean the data could have changed since then, but at least in the 1990s and early 2000s, if you were to do a survey among Canadians of what means more to you, what identity means more to you, your province, your provincial identity, or your national identity. The only two provinces where the national identity mattered more than the provincial identity was Ontario and Prince Edward Island. And Prince Edward Island, for people who don't know, it's about 100 and historically it's about 110,000 people who live there. Maybe it's 130 or 140,000 people now, but it's the smallest province. I don't want to say that it's inconsequential. It is consequential, but in the terms of national politics, it's not particularly consequential. Um, so for Ontarians, and I grew up in Ontario mostly, I grew up in Ontario. Um, the national identity matters a lot more than the provincial identity. I've also lived in two other parts of Canada. I lived in Nova Scotia for 5 years, and I've lived in Alberta the rest of the time in Canada. Um, in Nova Scotia, being Nova Scotian or being a maritimer, that region mattered a heck of a whole lot more to people than being Canadian. It wasn't that being Canadian wasn't important, but their provincial and local identity was far more superseded it significantly. The only major province where that is not the case is Ontario. And the reason, in my opinion, that that's not the case is that Ontario essentially governs the country. And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I am trying to say that when you're in the seat of power of a nation, and then you see yourself, you are embedded in the power of the nation. You see yourselves with this national identity in a way that, let's be honest, people who don't live in that power center feel, have a different feeling. Imagine people who lived in London during the British Empire. And I'm not trying to compare the two, so, please understand. I'm not comparing the two. I'm trying to explore an instinct rather than necessarily say that, Canadian Confederation is the equivalent of the British Empire, because of course it's not. It'll be a silly comparison. But I want to explore that instinct where if you lived in London at the peak of the British Empire, you would have seen yourself as your primary identity would have been British. It wouldn't have been being a Londoner. It would have been British. If you lived in Wales, maybe you saw yourself as British, but you probably saw yourself more as Welsh than British. Or Scotland. We all know that Scots see themselves as very Scottish, not necessarily British. If you were to poll England, Scotland, and Wales, even today, if you were to poll England, Scotland, and Wales, who do you think would have the strongest, which group would have the strongest British identity, and which would have the stronger regional identity? The English would certainly have the stronger British identity. I think we all appreciate that. And the Welsh and the Scots would have stronger regional identities, even today. And if you look back in time at the peak of the British Empire, kind of the instinct that I was trying to get at, if you lived in Britain, if you lived in the seat of power, you identify with the thing you are imposing your power over. And again, I'm not trying to compare the British Empire to Canadian Confederation. I'm trying to explore that instinct. You can see the same thing in the United States, where especially in the early 20th century, when power was very much concentrated on the East Coast of the United States, the most nationalist people in the United States were often on the East Coast because they saw themselves as these Americans, this American identity. Whereas if you removed yourself further from there, you started to see local identities and regional identities playing a stronger role. So, um, Ontario, which is the primary seat of power, sees itself as Canadian. The rest of the country has sort of a divided loyalty. Yes, they're Canadians, but primarily their identity and their loyalty is to their province or to their region. Nowhere is that clearer than Quebec. In Quebec, as I'm sure people understand, is a place where their relationship to Canada is a very challenging one. Going back to Quebec being conquered in 1759, it was, administered and depending on who you ask, oppressed by the British. It was given a degree of responsible government, basically the ability to determine, to have some control over its own affairs by the 1840s. Well, 1790s initially, but that's iffy, very iffy. It was something called representative government, but it was tightly controlled. Um, and so there's been this desire to protect the French language, the Quebec culture, from and frankly, the Quebec people, the French Canadian people, from what's been seen as like this oppressive Anglo structure, first the British Empire and then Canada, by many Quebecers. And so, if you drive around Quebec, you're far more likely to see the fleur de lis than you are the maple leaf. And the fleur de lis is the symbol of Quebec. So, again, I say all that just to remind people who are listening that the degree to which somebody really identifies with Canada is geographically determined. Canadian politics and this is my theory of Canadian politics. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? Canadian politics is politics of region. It's not, there is no, people will try to imagine that there's these ideologies that are sort of consistent across the country, that there's a conservative ideology, that there's or that there's ideologies that map onto parties, for instance. So the Conservative Party of Canada represents conservative Canadians. The New Democratic Party of Canada, which is sort of the Social Democratic Party, represents, the radical activist left in Canada. And then the Liberal Party represents centrist Canadians. But that's not totally true. The fact is that these ideologies are uniquely Canadian, and they're really regional identities. The ideologies are shadows on the cave wall. The actual form are regional interests. Donald Creighton, who's a great Canadian historian, Who wrote in the Empire of the St. Lawrence. His perspective on politics was that it is economic interest and it's economic classes competing with each other. The merchants, farmers, and industrialists, various classes. And I think Creighton's correct to a point. What's unique about Creighton is he doesn't really take ideology seriously. He takes economic interest seriously. Um, but the problem with Creighton's analysis is he was such a great historian of Upper Canada or of Ontario that he kind of imposed his framework on the entire country. And that isn't actually fair. I think Creighton does a really good job of analyzing politics in Ontario. I don't think it maps onto the rest of the country as well. And that's because in Canada, the politics is economic interest, but it's not class. It's locality. Whatever the economic interest of a particular locality is, and particularly their relationship to internal and external markets, is the determinative force as to what shapes their politics, and then to what shapes how they act politically inside of Confederation. Um, this is not to say that culture is not important. This is not to say that ideology plays no role. I'm just saying they don't play the decisive role. The one exception to that might be Quebec. If if I was writing this and not just doing this as like a video cast thing, I would make my argument for why I think it's true in Quebec too, but that would take a really long time, and I'm not really going to do that. So for today, I'll allow the exception of Quebec to stand and say that Quebec is driven by their politics is driven by this cultural fear of Anglo hegemony in the country. But English Canada, at least, its politics and its relationship with national politics are shaped by the economic interests of their region. The Liberal Party of Canada is not the party of centrists. It's the party of central Canada. It's the party of Canadian nationalism. Canadian nationalism, remember earlier I was saying how different provinces have kind of this fractured identity. Sometimes they prefer their province, in many provinces have a stronger allegiance to their province than they do to the country as a whole. In Ontario, that's not the case. They're Canadian nationalists in Ontario, and the Liberal Party is the party of Canadian nationalism. However, and this is where I think Ontarians struggle to appreciate this, and I don't blame Ontarians for not appreciating this. Just because they're nationalists, just because they think that they've got the interests of the entire country at heart, they sometimes don't realize how parochial they actually are in their interests. I'm going to get back to that. I'm going to let that hang for a while. But anyway, the Liberal Party is the party of central Canada, the party of Canadian nationalism. What its actual ideology is difficult to actually pin down beyond that. It wants a stronger federal government. That's probably been the key component of Liberal Party politics going back to the 1960s, really the 1950s and 40s, and probably earlier. The Liberal Party are Canadian nationalists who want Ottawa, the Canadian capital, to be the dominant force within Confederation. Ontarians are pretty happy with that. Why are Ontarians pretty happy with that? Well, a couple of reasons. One is that most of the population of Canada is in Ontario. It's the largest province by population. And it means, and so therefore, within the Parliament of Canada, Ontario is the largest political force. There's more seats from Ontario than there are from any other province, by a long shot. Even Quebec, which has an inflated number of seats in Parliament relative to their population, that's a constitutional agreement that goes a long way back, doesn't have the same number as Ontario. But between Ontario and Quebec, you have an absolutely dominant number of seats in the Canadian Parliament. And the Liberal Party tries to be the party of Ontario and Quebec, party of Central Canada, the party of Canadian nationalism. Now, the Canadian nationalism thing obviously has come, there's some issues for that in Quebec, where there is this very strong independence Quebec nationalism movement. What the Liberal Party basically tries to do is they say, okay, in Quebec, we are not going to get the Canadian nationalists to vote for us, but if we get all the Federalists, all the pro-Canadian people in Quebec to vote for us, that's enough. That's all we need. So the Liberal Party in Quebec, their goal is to make sure that all of the Federalist voters in Quebec vote for the Liberal Party. And that gives them the amount, especially because a lot of them are concentrated in urban areas, so that's very efficient from a seat count perspective. And then Ontario, and Ontarians identify far more with Ottawa than they do even with Queen's Park, which is in Toronto, which is where the provincial legislature is. So it understands that, again, in Quebec, where their main power base are the people who love Canada more than they love Quebec, or at least the people who, even though they love Quebec, love Canada also. And in Ontario, because so many Ontarians love Canada and identify more with Canada than they do with their own province, the Liberal Party is the party of Canadian nationalism. So far, I haven't said a word about economic interests. I'm going to get there. Okay, I'm just trying to lay out the party's perspectives here. The Conservative Party of Canada is the party of people, historically, has been the party of groups that want to give more power to the provincial capitals at the expense of Ottawa. That is the key, the kind of the historic, timeless distinction between the parties, at least going back again to the Second World War. Before that, it was a little muddier than that. So the Conservative Party of Canada, they're not conservatives, okay? They are not in any sense that, like, maybe they adopt some conservative trappings now and again, but you can't look at the Conservative Party of Canada and go, yes, that's the British Conservative Party. Or, oh yes, they've got very similar values to the American Republican Party. They just don't. They don't. And you can't make the comparison. Maybe they overlap sometimes, but that's almost as much by coincidence as anything else. The Conservative Party of Canada is the party of people who tend to prefer their provincial or regional identities over the national identity. Okay? The Conservative Party is the party of anti-Canadian nationalism, whereas the Liberal Party is the party of Canadian nationalism. Within Ontario, the Conservatives have to run a slightly different playbook, if I'm being honest. So, again, I'm not saying this is a perfect analogy. It works. I think it works as a framework, but there's, of course, small details. But outside of Ontario, at least, the Conservative Party of Canada is the party of people who refer their province or their localities or their region to the nation. And then outside of Ontario as well for the Liberals, the people who outside of Ontario are still diehard Canadian nationalists, and there are several of them, don't get me wrong. They tend to vote for the Liberal Party, even in places like Edmonton or Calgary or Vancouver. They don't win a lot of seats out there, but they might win one or two seats, and that's because there's areas that a lot of Ontarians have moved to, and tend to keep their political identities, their national identities, and bring it with them to those places. So, I say all that just so that people can kind of recognize that Canadian politics is regionally determined. Okay? In Ontario, here's where we get to the economic interest part. In Ontario, ever since Confederation, politics has been about protecting and expanding the manufacturing sector. Going back to 1867. And in Quebec, too. Although in Quebec, you also have not to say there isn't farm industries that are protected as well. In Quebec, there's a very powerful dairy industry that is the thorn in the side of American trade negotiators, but there's a very powerful dairy industry in Quebec. But the primary economic interest that unites Ontarians and Quebecers is manufacturing. Central Canada is the home of Canadian manufacturing. Going back to the 1830s, so even pre-Confederation, the Lachine Canal was constructed that allowed ships to bypass the Lachine Rapids in Montreal, and not only the intention was to allow larger ships to be able to get further into the Canadian interior than they could before with the rapids before on the St. Lawrence River. They had to portage about 8 or 9 miles, I think it was. But by building the canal, they could then use the canal. But almost by accident, what this allowed for is this created like this regular flow of water that went through the canal because it was an artificial flow, it was a regular flow. Was perfect for hydropower. And so all sorts of mills and factories developed alongside the Lachine Canal, which is what creates the Montreal working class suburbs and is the first major manufacturing hub in Canada. This is why so many banks began in Montreal. Canadian banks really got their start in Montreal. And then with Confederation and Ontario with the Great Lakes and rivers, there was manufacturing too. But in the wake of Confederation, why Confederation happens is still sort of there's a debate over it. But one of the primary things that leads to it is a collapse in trade negotiations between the Canadian colonies and the United States. After the Civil War, American grain farmers, particularly, are upset at the British and want a protected market for their crops, and so they abandon the 1851, I think it was 1851, free trade agreement with Canada, with the British colonies in North America, and so this creates the need for a new market, and so that's part of what helps establish Confederation. The national policy is John A. Macdonald, who's Canada's first prime minister, in his second term. He tries to build a railroad the first term. It's incredibly corrupt, and that's going all the way across Canada to compete with like the Union Pacific, called the Trans-Canada Railroad. There's a huge scandal. Very corrupt. He loses. Another guy, kind of liberal, comes in, Alexander Mackenzie. Macdonald comes back in 1874. Or 1875, and he establishes the Canadian national policy. And what that is a protectionist structure of very high tariff walls and subsidized manufacturing development. And that happens in Ontario. And so you get this industrialization of Ontario. And so now you have this major manufacturing interest group, economic interest group, in Ontario and Quebec. They disagree on a lot of things, but they do agree on the need for manufacturing and protected manufacturing. You know, there are carve outs for imperial trade and that kind of thing, but the real key is that it will not. Canadian manufacturers are going to have a leg up competing against American manufacturers. And there's no doubt that this leads to a major proliferation of industry in Ontario and Quebec. As Canada expands westward, however, the it's mostly agricultural. It's not industry. And so in the West, you've got an agricultural interest group. The West is a pretty poor place, if I'm being honest, inside of Confederation, especially compared to Ontario and Quebec, un until 1947. And 1947 is when Imperial Oil strikes the first major oil find in Western Canada. There's a minor oil find in Turner Valley at the turn of the 20th century that is still good, but 1947 is sort of the beginning of the modern oil industry in Canada. Leduc number one, if you ever fly into the Edmonton International Airport, it's not far away. There's a great interpreting center there. I encourage you to go check it out. These are bigger, much larger pools of oil, much larger deposits than had before. However, and this is something that I don't know that people appreciate, finding oil in Alberta is great for Alberta, but it doesn't do you much good if you live in Quebec. Why? It's a really long way to transport oil from Alberta to Quebec, or even Alberta to Ontario. The Liberal government in the 1950s actually constructs a pipeline, the interprovincial pipeline, to take oil from Alberta to central Canada, and it is the largest oil pipeline in the world at the time. For oil producers in Alberta, their major markets are export markets. It's not domestic. They're looking to export to the United States. So, immediately we begin to see a problem. If your economic interest is to export to the United States, you have a very different economic interest than if you live in Ontario at the time, where your goal is to protect your market from the United States. And if you are the dominant group in Parliament, you are going to be able to determine that. And so Albertans, for the first 20 or 30 years of the oil industry in Alberta, it was still infant enough that this was an irritant, but it wasn't catastrophic, this distinction. And central Canada at the time recognized that the export of Alberta oil brought in a lot of foreign exchange. And so they did seek, for instance, they built a line to northwest Michigan. They built the first Trans Mountain pipeline to Vancouver, and with a spur down to Seattle. This allowed for Alberta oil to bring in foreign exchange. But remember, Alberta wants to export oil. And so after 1947, the primary economic interest of Alberta, and it becomes the primary political interest of Alberta, is to export its mineral resources. Ontario and Quebec, other than perhaps the gains that are to be made on foreign exchange, by bringing in foreign exchange by selling this Alberta oil don't really benefit from it economically. It's great for Alberta, doesn't really affect them. Why? Yes, there will be some oil that's brought in. I mentioned on that interprovincial pipeline, but in Eastern Canada, it's way cheaper to import oil than, and a lot of it's actually coming from Venezuela at the time, but not just Venezuela, but the, after the Arab deposits are found, Arab countries' deposits are found, and a couple of other places in the Caribbean, and even some American oil. It's way cheaper to bring in oil from the Middle East, frankly, than it is to bring in oil from Alberta if you live in Ontario. It's just a great distance. And this great distance is important in understanding Canadian politics. Again, one of the reasons it's so important is that Canadians in the West and Canadians in the East don't communicate much. Westerners maybe have gone to Eastern Canada once in their lives. Most Westerners, if you were to go on the street in Calgary, maybe Red Deer. Let's take Red Deer for example, which is a city in between Calgary and Edmonton. If you were to walk on the street in Red Deer and ask like 50 people, have you ever been to Ottawa? Have you ever been to Montreal? Have you ever been to Toronto? Some people will say yes, but very few will say they've been to all three, and even fewer would say they've been to any of them more than once or twice. And if I was to reverse that experiment and I was to go to Mississauga, which is a suburb of Toronto, and ask everybody, have you been to Alberta? Most people might say, I went to Banff National Park once, and that was it. It's really expensive to travel in Canada. It's really expensive to pump oil from Alberta to Ontario, just like it's really expensive to fly from Ontario to Alberta or Alberta to Ontario. And so you have these two completely different political communities emerging. They're inside the same framework, which is sort of an accident of history, but their economic interests are completely separate. And as a community, they don't really interact much. They're very different economies. Other than maybe the same other than the same big banks, there's not really a major economic relationship between these countries other than the banking sector. So for most Albertans and most Ontarians, they're very different places, let alone Quebec, which speaks a very different language from Alberta. You're not going to find bilingual people in Alberta, very many. There's a few, but there aren't many. So they're separate places. And one of these places has significantly more political power than the other. Let's go back to the mid-20th century. In the 1950s, you start to see the West emerge as its own distinct political bloc. Before then, it was kind of, both conservative and liberal parties, which they were associated with different groups inside of Ontario and Quebec, but primarily Ontario. Quebec were largely liberals by the mid-20th century. And what they would basically do was compete with each other in central Canada, and each would try to compete to win votes in Western Canada in order to bring up their majorities, in order to drive up their votes. But really, Western Canada is not a political bloc until after 1947, until after oil is discovered. By the mid-1950s, you're starting to see Alberta and the prairies begin to cooperate as a political bloc. They do so under John Diefenbaker, who's a conservative prime minister, until 1963. After 1960, in those years, you start to see the West vote monolithically for the Conservatives, and it becomes this political bloc. And Central Canada views this Western political bloc as kind of an emerging threat, and this is when they really kind of become the liberal parties back, like where Ontario and Quebec begin to kind of cooperate, at least Federalists in Ontario and Quebec begin to cooperate within the Liberal Party in order to make sure that they continue governing the country and not the Western Bloc. Okay, So after the 50s and 60s, this is the major Canadian political competition for power in Ottawa, is the Western Bloc versus the Central Canadian Bloc. And when I say the Central Canadian Bloc again, what I mean is not everybody in Quebec and everybody in Ontario. What I really mean are Canadian nationalists in Ontario and Canadian nationalists in Quebec, federalists in Quebec. Okay? Um, in the 1970s, there were two significant oil shocks. Um, one that with the Yom Kippur War, where OPEC imposes a major boycott or embargoes the United States, and then in 1979 in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. These oil shocks are devastating, lead to huge increases in the price of oil. If you live in Eastern Canada, this is horrific for you. Remember, manufacturing sector, they need a lot of oil, right? If this is terrible for you because remember, Eastern Canada, they're importing their oil. In Western Canada, this could be really good. This huge price increase opportunity is really good for you, provided you can export it. In 1980, Pierre Trudeau, after really an embarrassing showing by the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, returns to power after about 8 months out of power. And with a very large majority, Pierre Trudeau was a Liberal. And as part of his program, in order to make Canada more resilient against oil shocks, is he puts into place something called the National Energy Program. The National Energy Program was the bête noire of the West. This is the real origin story of Alberta separatism. In the East, the National Energy Program, what it does is it tries to create a blended price of national and international prices. And the goal was so that when there's an oil shock, to make sure that Canadians paid a much lower price for oil than the global price. As you can imagine, if you're an oil producer, this is not good news. If you're an oil consumer, it's very good news. So a series of price controls are imposed. They also, um, they also, and this might be the thing that irritates Alberta almost more than anything else. If you are going to basically not prevent, but and because I don't want to go too far with the language here, if you are going to restrict Alberta's ability to export oil for the benefit of Eastern Canadian consumers, one of the questions that you're going to get is, okay, well, how are we ever going to attract foreign investment in order to explore more lands, in order to drill for more oil? And the Liberal government's response was, well, we're going to get more Canadians to invest in the Canadian oil industry. And we're going to give them huge incentives to do so, to explore on Canadian federal land, where the federal government would be the landowner and the federal government would be getting licensing and royalties, as opposed to exploring on private land or provincial land. This sets up a major clash between the leader of the Progressive Conservative government in Alberta, Peter Lougheed, a man who was elected in 1972, and was really in many ways the architect of the modern Alberta state and its relationship with oil, and Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. In addition, as part of the National Energy Program, there was a pre-tax royalty that was imposed, something like another 6 to 8 cents which meant that, and that was going to go to the federal government, which was then technically going to be used to return to the oil sector somehow in some complicated aspect of accounting. Accounts differ here as to what actually was the purpose of the National Energy Program, um, whether it would have ever worked. Uh, in the end, Alberta um, hated it. They hated it. They viewed this as an unnecessary imposition of Ottawa over Alberta's economy, Alberta's political structure, Alberta's government. And this led to the first crisis of what they call Western alienation. And really, the origins of the modern Alberta separatist movement go back to this period. Um, the thing that probably stops Alberta separatism at the time is that the Progressive Conservatives returned to power in 1984 under Brian Mulroney, and he cancels the program immediately, with huge majority in Alberta and actually in Quebec. Um, However, this Western populist anti-government, anti-Ottawa sentiment was planted in the ground, and it wasn't uprooted. It might have been like trimmed, and it might have been prevented from growing further, but it didn't go away. And so, in when the Progressive Conservative government, aside from getting rid of the National Energy Program under Brian Mulroney, who was a Quebecer, doesn't necessarily. He makes some mistakes in dealing with Alberta and dealing with that Western Bloc that I kind of talked about earlier. And the Western Bloc essentially leaves the Conservative Party. They form the Reform Party under a guy named Preston Manning, and their political demand, their slogan is "The West wants in." We want in. They believed that political power in Canada was entirely for the benefit of central Canada, and their interests were being ignored. And they had a case. They frankly had a case. The national policy had imposed these massive tariffs. It had made it much more difficult for Alberta oil producers to export their oil. Yes, some oil had been exported, but that was for the benefit of foreign exchange, and Eastern Canadians didn't really care about that much. Technocrats did, but ordinary Eastern Canadians didn't. And so then with the national energy policy, it was great for Eastern Canadian consumers, but it was devastating for Western Alberta producers. And if you look at the bankruptcy numbers and the foreclosure numbers at the time, they're astonishing. Now, there's a glut on the oil market, so there was, you can say that, well, global structural conditions were bad for the national, were bad for Western oil producers, not the national energy policy. And the Liberal Party has tried to make that argument many times. However, there's no doubt that the national energy policy exacerbated the structural problems. Alberta separatism, free trade, frankly, with the United States. Beginning in 1988, with the free trade agreement, and then with the NAFTA in 1993, really takes the pressure off Alberta. They can now export a lot of. There's no legal mechanisms preventing their ability to export oil. The only thing that prevents their ability to export oil is transmission capacity. And so by train, by pipeline, they are sending lots of oil into the United States. And the United States is the consumer for something like 98% of Alberta's oil. For Americans who are listening to this, part of energy independence includes Canada, frankly. Canadian oil. And Albertans, because the Alberta oil sector only has one primary customer for its oil, it has to sell at a discount. And so there's the Canadian discount that's on the price. So Albertans don't get as much as they would theoretically get on the true global market, just because of the fact that they're locked into one customer. And then what American oil refiners do quite intelligently is they buy a whole bunch of Alberta oil at a discount, refine it, and then sell it on the global market. So a lot of the oil that American oil companies are actually selling on the global market is actually Alberta. They bought at a discount from Alberta. So anyway, um, this takes the pressure off. And then what really happens to really excite Albertans is that in 2006, a government, the Conservative Party of Canada, I mentioned earlier that the Progressive Conservative Party, the Western Bloc, kind of split off from it. So you had this rump Eastern Canadian Conservative Party called the Progressive Conservative Party. Then you had the Reform Party, which was a Western party, and then the Reform Party became the Canadian Alliance. That's a story we don't want to talk about. In 2004, because they believed that basically if they were going to stay separate, the Liberals would govern forever, they decided to reunite under Stephen Harper, who becomes prime minister in 2006 in his second election that he runs as leader of this newly united Conservative Party. He then wins another minority in 2008 and wins the majority in 2011. So remember back when that guy Preston Manning, who was the leader of the Reform Party at the end of the 1980s, was saying the West wants in. Well, by 2010, the West was not only in, the West was the primary driving force behind the government for the first time in history. First time in Canadian history. Maybe with the exception of Diefenbaker in the 1950s for a short period of even Mulroney, when he was prime minister, progressive conservative premier from 84 to 93, Quebec played a large role in that. That was an alliance between the West and Quebec. And unsurprisingly, catastrophically split apart because the interests were too divisive. They're too divided in economic interest. In 2015, when Justin Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau's son, is elected prime minister with a very large majority, Alberta's kicked to the sidelines again. While earlier Liberal governments, I mentioned, earlier Liberal governments were not opposed to Canadian Alberta oil development, even if maybe they didn't facilitate it as much as they would have liked to, and even if sometimes they put barriers on to reduce the pricing or, for the benefit of Eastern consumers, or they certainly privilege the interests of Canadian manufacturing, central Canadian manufacturing, over the desires of Alberta. Even under the national policy before free trade, Liberal governments, still wanted to export oil. They still wanted to develop and explore, develop, and export oil. It was good foreign exchange, right? With the election of Justin Trudeau in 2015, you now have a government in power in Ottawa that isn't interested in that. It's a younger government. It's a very socially progressive government, and its footprint, a big part of its coalition are what you might call green voters, who are hostile to the carbon emissions created by the Canadian energy sector. And there's this notion of the tar sands. I didn't really want to get into this much, but Alberta oil is divided into really two separate industries inside of Alberta. There's the crude oil industry, and then there's the bitumen heavy oil industry, primarily concentrated around Fort McMurray, and that requires an extra step. It has to be upgraded before it can be refined. And that oil's it's more expensive. And there are bitumen in some cases, not all cases, but in a couple of early cases, and in one major mine, is basically mined, and it's an open pit mine. So it looks horrific in pictures. And then there's the carbon emissions that theoretically come out of this because there's an extra step in processing it. And there's this sort of this notion of heavy heavy oil. That's just it's a climate apocalypse, and it's mostly fanciful. That whole, the carbon emissions. There's extra steps to the processing of it. In an open pit mine, there's going to be more carbon emissions as far as actually getting the oil out. So there is some more carbon emissions that come from it, but it's not what people imagine it to be. Um, and so there was this goal among the Trudeau coalition, and whether Justin Trudeau and the technocrats around him actually wanted to do this or not is probably an open question. But there was a lot of political pressure put on him by this younger Eastern coalition to basically shut down the oil sands because it was the oil sands, which is where the heavy oil was, and along with it, basically the conventional oil industry too, because they didn't really know the difference between the two, if I'm being honest, and so were pretty they didn't exactly they weren't discriminating, at least in their rhetoric and in the policies that come out of this. So um, before Trudeau's elected, there's a recognition in the Alberta oil industry that the biggest handicap moving forward is transmission capacity. They've just maxed it out. And so new pipelines are going to need to be built. Americans are going to remember the Keystone Pipeline. So the Keystone Pipeline was always down through the United States, um, which was going to, I'm not going to get into it. That's a rabbit hole I'm not going to get into. It would be good transmission capacity for Canadians. We'll leave for the Alberta oil industry. We'll leave it at that. Um, that was always the favored expansion of transmission capacity. However, in order for that to be in order to do that, you needed the cooperation of the United States government. And the United States government, particularly when Barack Obama was in power, was caught between two interest groups itself: the shale oil producers and the green energy movement in the United States. They wanted to block the Keystone Pipeline. Shale oil producers because they didn't want the competition, and green energy oil because they viewed the Alberta oil as being the tar sands, this evil climate apocalypse thing. So it was always going to be kind of hard to push it. And so Harper did push it really hard when he was in government with the Obama administration. But the Obama administration was favorable to it, but it was always politically difficult for them. And then there was a lawsuit in Nebraska over the actual routing of the Keystone Pipeline. And anyway, it ends up never getting built. Um, the As opposed to the Keystone Pipeline, there's a couple of other pipelines that are proposed as well. One is Northern Gateway, and the Northern Gateway pipeline was supposed to lead from just outside of Edmonton, essentially, and it was going to go to a town on the North Pacific coast of British Columbia called Kitimat. And it was believed that and the idea was that Kitimat was going to become this oil export hub to take oil to Asia. Remember how I said earlier that most Alberta oil is exported exclusively to the United States? Well, this was going to be a point by which oil could be exported to the world. So it wouldn't just be the United States is the only customer anymore. Now Asia could be the customer. And now Canadian Alberta oil producers wouldn't have to sell at the discount. Keystone would still allow, would allow oil to sell at a discount. It was always the cheapest pipeline. It was always the most economic pipeline. It always made the most sense. But the next pipeline in the hopper was again was going to be built by this company called Enbridge, called Northern Gateway. However, Northern Gateway required going through British Columbia. And a lot of the territory in British Columbia that it was going to have to go over is Indigenous territory. And without getting into the really nitty gritty legal weeds here, probably because I just shouldn't anyway, because I probably don't know enough. I definitely don't know. I know more than I know enough to get me into trouble. So I'm just going to leave it alone. But in British Columbia, a lot of the land is not handled by treaties. The treaties have ceded land from Indian or from indigenous tribes to. In the United States, the term Indian is used far more frequently than in Canada. In Canada, it's a terrible term to use. You don't use it. So after living in the United States for a long enough time and talking about these issues in the United States, I sometimes end up using when I say indigenous, I kind of get some weird looks. People don't know what I'm saying. So I've kind of gotten accustomed to using the word Indian. So I do apologize for that for people who are listening who are offended by it. That's not my intent. But Indigenous land in Canada, in British Columbia, was never ceded by treaty. it was ceded. It's sort of this really strange ad hoc process, which means that anytime you're going to build a major piece of infrastructure in this part of British Columbia, you're going to have to get every band, every Indigenous band, every First Nations band on side to do it, which is really tricky because Indigenous politics is divided among the band council and the hereditary elders, and the hereditary elders don't have day-to-day political control, but they still have some like spiritual legacy control and power, and they are particularly likely to get wrapped in with green movements and organized green groups in Canada are really good at bringing hereditary elders in order to push their agenda forward, launch lawsuits to try to block these things. Um, in the Canadian Constitution that was passed in 1981, there was a Section 35 was added, which basically gave the courts the ability to make sure that Indigenous people got enough consultation, essentially. And the courts would determine when Indigenous groups received enough consultation. This is endless lawsuits have come out of this. And then when the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was passed, the Harper government said that we appreciate the principles of the UNDRIP. We generally accept them, but we aren't going to. But that doesn't mean that we're going to accept them on all levels. When the Trudeau government was brought into power, this is especially there was a major truth and reconciliation process in Canada in response to just some basically recognition that Canadian Indigenous people have been treated pretty terribly, rather terribly, um, by the Canadian government. And the Trudeau government is elected in the wake of this in 2015, again, bringing this Green coalition. And also this, but the Trudeau government, unlike Harper, who sort of said, yes, we appreciate the UNDRIP, and yes, we, we will acknowledge it, we'll abide by it to a point. The Trudeau government said, we are going to abide by it completely. And so what this has done, that along with Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, it has given Indigenous groups, Indigenous claims can be used to block major infrastructure projects. And so the ability of going into BC, Northern Gateway Pipeline, and then just being able to go to Kitimat and being able to export oil off of Kitimat was blocked essentially in the courts through Indigenous claims. And the courts came to the conclusion that Enbridge had not done enough consultation in order to do it. And Enbridge was like, screw it. We've already spent God knows how many $billions on this, just on the consultation. We're not going to go through this process again. We're out. And so Northern Gateway was lost. And the Liberal government didn't really lift a finger for it. It didn't necessarily actively participate in its destruction, although it did. It indirectly participated in its destruction, but it didn't actively participate. The Liberal government would then, under Trudeau, would then say, yes, we lost Northern Gateway, and yes, we didn't get Keystone. One of the reasons they didn't get Keystone is when Donald Trump came to power in 2017, the Liberal government just really never brought it up with Trump, never pushed it with Trump, because I really think they felt that the green parts of their coalition and their social justice minded aspects of their coalition just didn't want Keystone built. They didn't want the Alberta energy sector to expand, and so they actively prevented that. In addition, they passed several laws. One would be the tanker ban that essentially prevents oil tankers, from being able to traverse up the northwest coast of BC, and so that would have blocked Kitimat, Prince Rupert, other places that you might have sent a pipeline to, which meant that really the only place you can send a pipeline to on the west coast of Canada now is Vancouver. In addition, the Trudeau government imposed a carbon tax. They also have imposed other major regulatory hurdles, which made it far more difficult to be able to build new oil infrastructure. So not just pipelines, but also just new projects became a lot more difficult. And so what ended up happening is after 2015, all of these things happening together, not only did you not get Keystone, not only did they not get Northern Gateway, but basically, especially after the price of oil collapsed in 2014, and that had nothing to do with the Liberals, so it's completely global structural problem. But as the rest of the oil, as other oil economies recovered, particularly places like North Dakota, shale revolution, recovered, Alberta never recovered. People will look at the Alberta oil economy and say, look, Alberta is one of the richest parts of Canada, and sure, that's true, but Albertans would look at North Dakota and say, oh, they're a heck of a lot richer than we are. And so because of the new regulatory hurdles, because of the Northwest, because of so the new regulatory hurdles and the carbon tax, you just and just the lower price of oil anyway, um, come just private investment dried up. There's also a big fire in Fort McMurray, 2018, that kind of steam was lost out of the Alberta oil industry. Not all of it is the Liberals' fault. Should be very clear. But some of it is. And so Albertans are left with this challenging situation in the 2020s where Albertans want to sell their oil. They need transmission capacity, and they preferably like to sell it without the discount, though they'll suffer the discount. And they want to be able to dig, they want to be able to drill more, they want to be able to expand their production capacity, they want to expand exploration, they want to expand export capacity. They look at Confederation and see that they're not sure they could do it inside of Confederation. And it doesn't help, frankly, that Ontarians generally don't understand the perspective of Albertans. When the Trump administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, automobiles, the Canadian government responded by imposing retaliatory tariffs. That's fine. Got to do it in a trade negotiation. Makes sense. But those retaliatory tariffs mean that now Alberta, which doesn't have a major manufacturing industry, there's manufacturing in Alberta, but it's basically to service the oil industry. Now Albertans have to pay more for goods in order to protect, because of the tariffs that were really imposed on Eastern Canadian goods. So because those tariffs are imposed on Eastern Canadian goods by the United States, and then Canada responded again with retaliatory tariffs. Albertans have to pay more for goods than they would otherwise. And so they look at an Ottawa as a government that can't wait to respond to protect manufacturing from American threats, but has done practically nothing to facilitate the expansion of its major industry, and has typically been kind of hostile to it. So that's basically the context. And again, one of the things that I mentioned, that Ontarians don't understand Albertans, and so Ontarians can be really dismissive and condescending to Albertans. So and Albertans really feel that, really sense that. And that's, I think, one of the things that exacerbates this problem. I think if there was better communication, I honestly think if there was more movement between Alberta and Ontario, of people more visiting, this problem could probably resolve itself. But there isn't. And you've got political parties that see political gain in this, so I was going to stop it. But so Alberta separatism has become this. Those are the grievances. I've laid out the grievances. Okay, and I hope I've done it in a fair way. The Alberta separatist movement is, again, I mentioned it was kind of a small group. It is gaining more notoriety. Again, this petition got something over 300,000 signatures, which is enough to get it on the referendum, by Alberta law, brought in by the Alberta Conservative government, is enough to bring a referendum. Here's the problem that separatists face. I laid out the grievances, right? Um, and so there's the separatist group in Canada, in Alberta, believe that, well, you know what? If we could just get out of Canada, we wouldn't have these things blocking our access. And the reasonable question is, okay, Alberta's a landlocked place. Where's it going to sell its oil? Oh, I also forgot to mention there was another pipeline that brought up energy east. There was a lot more to the pipeline story. I've talked for long enough. I don't need to get into it. Look up Energy East, and then look up the way that the Liberals fumbled the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline to Vancouver. Yes, they ended up building it, and they had to do it with public dollars, but they basically chased away CNRL, which was the major private. I think it was CNRL, was the major private developer of it. But anyway, look, if you listen this long, you can look that up. With the way that the courts have developed in Canada, the way that Ottawa seems pretty eager to pursue net zero or some other form of environmental policy, Albertans look at them and go, well, we do oil. What do you want us to do? We do oil. And Ontarians will say, well, you should do something else. They will say this from time to time, and that's silly because none of them have ever looked at a map. Look where Alberta is on a map. It's not like you can do manufacturing because there's not an easy place to transport stuff to. There's no major American markets nearby. Southern Ontario, if you look at Southern Ontario, it's like a dagger into the heart of the U.S. Midwest, right? Detroit, Cleveland, you know, Chicago, not very far away. Major American economic centers are right there. Alberta, it's a long way to Montana still. So the only thing you're likely going to be, your Alberta industry is going to be staples dependent, and the primary staple is oil. Anyway, so it has reached the point where there's a lot of Albertans who just want out of Canada, and they don't really care what the consequences are. At this point, I think it's a lot of Albertans just want to punish Canadians. They view Alberta as punishing Canadians. I mean, I didn't even talk about the equalization discussion. My God, I missed a lot. So Albertans believe they pay more into Confederation, which means they pay more basically in there's tax dollars that leave Alberta and are sent to other provinces and help them to pay for provincial services because Alberta is viewed as this wealthy province. And so, because it's the wealthiest province, it should subsidize the other provinces. That's very complicated, and there's people who are going to get really upset with the way that I explain that. Have to allow it. That's how Albertans understand it. And so, these are the grievances are pretty significant. And I personally, I'm sympathetic to it. I am sympathetic to it. I see their points. And the Trudeau government, one of the reasons I believe that the whole Canadian economy really struggled under Justin Trudeau was because he ignored the oil industry. He didn't realize how important the oil industry was for the Canadian economy overall. And by not shutting it down, but by fatally weakening it, the entire economy struggles. Productivity numbers were abysmal. But for Albertans, the question is, what's their future? And I think my suspicion is that most Albertans want a referendum, and want to just register loudly and very noisily their anger over half a century of treatment by Eastern Canada. And if there was a tool by which they could do that, and they'd be relatively guaranteed that at least Eastern Canadians would listen to them, they'd probably accept it. And that'd be it. But it's reached the point where many Albertans just want to get out. And the reality is that Alberta probably can't survive on its own, so that if it left, let's just assume it could leave. There's lots of legal questions and dicey legal questions around that, but let's just accept that it could leave. That would probably mean moving into the United States. Whether the United States would accept that or not is a different question. Not one that I'm going to dig into. But A problem with the Alberta separatists, this is the politics of it, in Alberta, one of the problems that the Alberta separatists have is they don't really have mainstream elite leadership. What they have, and listen, if you're listening to this, guys, maybe be offended. I don't intend for you to be offended. I'm just calling balls and strikes here. Your leadership is Alberta separatist leadership is very unimpressive. And it is um, they're and frankly they struggle to follow the rules. This is a big problem for the separatist movement is they don't have good leadership. Until they have good leadership, I suspect it's not going anywhere. And there's a reason, one of the reasons it doesn't have good leadership is I think the people in Alberta who are just as angry at Ottawa as a lot of as the separatist groups are, recognize that there's not much of an alternative. Either you separate and you become a landlocked, isolated republic that, is has no major country in any sense trying to help it export oil, or it becomes part of the United States. And I think most Alberta's leadership knows that if it were to join the United States, 35 to 40% of Albertans wouldn't accept it. I don't know what that number is. It could be more than that. It might be less. While there's a lot of pro-Alberta sentiment, that doesn't necessarily translate into pro-American sentiment. And the fact that Donald Trump is president doesn't help either. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, we all know he's polarizing, and many Canadians are insulted by him, including Albertans. If there was a different guy as president, maybe they'd be more into it. But Donald Trump is, for a lot of Albertans, the notion of leaving Canada, as much as they hate the Liberals, and they hate Mark Carney a lot, but many Albertans might hate Donald Trump more. And so, you know, and I think the mainstream elite leadership of Alberta, the people you might find, the corporate lawyers, the guys who work for firms like ManX or something like that, guys who are guys who you'd find at the Petroleum Club in Calgary, the really they're not in the separatist movement. And so I think Albertans are, if we look at the Quebec separatist movement, its first prominent leader was a guy named René Lévesque, who was a very impressive guy. And I think René Lévesque gave Quebecers the sense that, oh, if you're on board for this, then I guess it's safe. Maybe not perfectly safe, but it's safe. We trust you, dear captain, in the case of René Lévesque. Alberta doesn't have that figure. Alberta doesn't have that major mainstream figure among the separatist movements that inspires confidence. Instead, unfortunately, what they have are guys who play loose with the rules, are not likely to reach that necessary group of Albertans that's necessary to give the movement critical mass in order to separate. Doesn't mean it won't. Now, I want to be clear here. There's a lot of Ontarians and a lot of Central Canadians who look at the general crumminess of your average Alberta separatist leader, and I mean that. They look at that. This is not to say that Alberta separatists. Listen. Okay, I respect your opinion on this, and I respect most of you. I really do. I just struggle to respect the leadership of these movements. There was a recent data leak due to, again, just not playing by the rules, this Alberta separatist group. And there are people in Eastern Canada who are saying things like, well, then, clearly this whole project, we don't have to acknowledge this project anymore, we should just shut it down. its democratic legitimacy has been lost. Therefore, we could shut down the project. Problem is, that horse is out of the barn. Albertans want to vote. Albertans are not going to prosecute this on procedural crimes. Okay? And the people out there who think they should prosecute it on procedural crimes, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, I don't know. But I can tell you that Albertans don't care about the data leak. They should maybe, but they don't. And they aren't caring about some of the weirder stuff that the Alberta separatist leadership is indulging in. Many Albertans will forgive them that, because at least they're shouting, at least they're saying the things that so many Albertans want. I don't know about most, but so many Albertans want. I don't know that Albertans want to separate, or even most, or even a major of them want to separate, but they want respect in Canada. And they don't feel like they've gotten it in a very long time. And moving forward with the way that the courts are structured, even though the Liberals are going to say, like, well, Mark Carney has done so much for the Alberta oil sector. Like, Mark Carney has said some of the right things, but he hasn't said enough, if I'm being honest. And also the proof is in the pudding. Little has been done. Some has been done, but little has been done. And whether Mark Carney's responsible for this, or it's the fact that he largely inherited Justin Trudeau's caucus and apparatus, he kind of got grafted onto the top of it. Carney's from Edmonton. And I actually don't think he's anywhere near as hostile to Alberta. He's from Alberta, and I don't think he's particularly hostile to. Yes, he's sort of this champion of net zero, but he also understands how foreign exchange works. So I don't think he's necessarily hostile to Alberta's interests. What he's trying to do is try to find a way to fit it in a way that's like the third or fourth. He's trying to accommodate, he's trying to do what's the least he can do for Alberta that Alberta accepts. And I don't think it's going to be enough. Doesn't mean I think Alberta's going to vote to separate, because it's awfully scary to do such a thing. And even if they vote to separate, whether it gets acknowledged, it's a completely open question. But Eastern Canadians need to recognize that this referendum is going to happen. And the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, is getting criticized on all sides right now. But she's going to have to make something like this referendum happen. Albertans are just, they won't accept it any other way. And the horse is out of the barn. And there are a lot of people to blame for that. But the horse is out of the barn. And we're going to see what happens. Anyway, so that was what I'd hoped to do in 45 minutes. It took me 90 minutes. And even then, I didn't even get into all the things I assumed I was going to get into. But there we are. So if you're interested in Alberta politics, if you're interested in what this Alberta thing is that's going on, hopefully this 90-minute primer, my God, 90 minutes, I never thought I'd be able to talk about it this long. This is why I need a co-host in order to keep me in order to keep me grounded. But thanks again. Next week, we'll be back to our regularly scheduled summer programming at least. And we should be ready to go with some really interesting guests. Once again, thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Be sure to like and subscribe. Again, sorry that this was all me. Hopefully I do a better job moving forward.